As the Germans continued to watch, something even more surprising happened. American soldiers began to emerge from their positions and form lines, orderly queues of men holding metal trays and cups, standing in the rain with their helmets tilted to keep the water out of their faces. Steam rose from the serving area as soldiers with ladles began filling those trays with hot food, scooping portions of stew and vegetables, and passing out bread and coffee with the kind of casual efficiency that spoke of routine rather than special occasion. The Germans watched this scene unfold with a sense of complete cognitive dissonance, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught about how armies operated under combat conditions. These American soldiers were not huddled in foxholes waiting for the shelling to stop, not crouched in bunkers with their weapons at the ready, not doing any of the things that soldiers were supposed to do when they were this close to the enemy. Instead, they were calmly eating a hot meal as if they were at some kind of bizarre outdoor picnic, steam rising from their food into the cold rain, the whole scene illuminated by carefully shielded lanterns that provided just enough light to see by without making them too obvious a target. And what made it even more disturbing from the German perspective was that the Americans didn't seem to be slowing down their operations in any way to accommodate this feeding. Patrols continued to go out, moving past the field kitchens on their way to the front line. Artillery batteries continued to fire in the distance, the sound of the guns a constant backdrop to the scene. Radio operators continued their work, antennas visible in the gathering darkness. The Americans had somehow managed to integrate the business of feeding their troops so seamlessly into their combat operations that the two activities were happening simultaneously without apparent conflict or compromise. One of the German corporals, a man who had been in the army long enough to remember the early days of the war when German logistics had functioned relatively well, muttered that in the Wehrmacht, soldiers often went 24 hours or more without a hot meal during active operations, and sometimes much longer than that if the fighting was particularly intense or if supply lines were disrupted. The idea that you could simply stop in the middle of a battle to cook and serve hot food to hundreds of men had always seemed not just impractical, but actively detrimental to combat effectiveness, a distraction that would leave you vulnerable and slow your momentum. Yet here were the Americans doing exactly that, and far from being vulnerable or slow, they seemed to be advancing steadily through the forest, pushing the German defenders back step by step. The sight of those American soldiers standing in the rain eating their hot food began to chip away at years of indoctrination and propaganda. If the enemy was truly soft, as they had been told so many times, if they were really these pampered, undisciplined soldiers who couldn't handle real hardship, then how were they managing to fight so effectively while maintaining this level of logistical support? How were they advancing when by all rights their supply trains should have collapsed under the weight of bringing all these luxuries forward? The questions didn't have easy answers, and in the absence of answers, doubt began to creep in. That night in the dugout, as the rain continued to fall and the smell of American coffee continued to drift across the no-man's land, the German soldiers talked in hushed voices about what they had witnessed. The jokes and mockery from earlier had faded, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of envy and confusion, and the first glimmerings of respect. One soldier, speaking so quietly that the others had to lean in to hear him, admitted that he would give almost anything for just one bowl of hot soup, just one cup of real coffee, something to warm the cold that seemed to have taken permanent residence in his bones. The others nodded in agreement, though none of them wanted to say it too loudly, as if acknowledging their hunger might somehow make it worse. For the first time, the joke about the American field kitchens didn't seem like a joke at all, but rather like a question that demanded an answer, a puzzle that they couldn't quite solve with the knowledge and assumptions they had been given. And that answer, that understanding of what they were really facing, would come much sooner than any of them expected, though it would come in circumstances none of them would have chosen. The fighting through that autumn was relentless and grinding, the kind of combat that wore men down through sheer attrition rather than through any single dramatic battle. German units that had already been stretched thin by years of war found themselves stretched even thinner, defending positions that seemed to grow less defensible with each passing day, watching their ammunition supplies dwindle, feeling their stomachs grow emptier as the supply situation deteriorated. During one chaotic engagement near a small crossroads that had changed hands several times already, a squad of German infantry found themselves in an impossible position, cut off from their main unit by an American advance that had been faster and more coordinated than anyone had anticipated. They spent the night pinned down in a small copse of trees, hearing American voices all around them in the darkness, knowing that attempting to break through would likely result in casualties they couldn't afford. When dawn came and made their situation clear, when they could see that they were completely surrounded with no realistic possibility of escape or relief, their officer made the decision that every soldier dreaded, but that was sometimes the only rational choice available. They would surrender rather than die pointlessly in a position that no longer mattered. The men gathered what little equipment they still had, made sure their weapons were clearly visible and pointed at the ground, and with hands raised and hearts pounding, they emerged from their cover and began walking slowly toward the American lines, expecting at any moment to hear the crack of rifle fire. The reception they received was not what they had anticipated based on the stories they had heard about American brutality and lack of discipline. There was no shouting, no rifle butts to the ribs, no casual violence of the sort that had become depressingly common in this war. Instead, an American sergeant approached with an expression of professional competence, conducting himself with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what needed to happen. The Germans were frisked quickly and thoroughly for weapons, their uniform pockets checked for grenades or other hidden dangers, and then tags were attached to their uniforms indicating their status as prisoners of war. Throughout this process, the Americans were brisk but not brutal, treating the captured Germans as a logistical problem to be processed rather than as enemies to be punished. The sergeant directed them toward a cluster of tents that had been set up in what appeared to be a rear area, though given how close the sound of fighting still was, it couldn't have been very far behind the actual front lines. The German prisoners stumbled along, exhausted and hungry and frightened of what might come next, their minds filled with stories they had heard about prison camps and interrogations. At first, when they saw the tents ahead, they assumed they were being taken to some kind of temporary holding area where they would be questioned before being moved further back. Then the wind shifted and they smelled it, that same smell that had drifted across the no man's land on that rainy night. Coffee and onions and meat, the unmistakable aroma of food being cooked in large quantities. The prisoners looked at each other in confusion, wondering if they were being taken to where the Americans themselves ate, if perhaps they would be made to watch while their captors enjoyed hot meals as some form of psychological torture. But as they came closer to the source of the smell, they saw something that made absolutely no sense within their understanding of how prisoner treatment was supposed to work. Under camouflage netting that provided protection from both weather and aerial observation, one of the American mobile field kitchens sat steaming in the cold morning air, its kettles full and its burners going, with soldiers in aprons rather than combat gear moving around it with the practiced efficiency of professional cooks. The kettles were enormous, large enough to feed hundreds of men, and the smell coming from them was rich and complex, speaking of real ingredients and actual cooking rather than the thin, barely flavoured soups the Germans had grown accustomed to. The prisoners were directed into a line, not a separate line, but the same line that American soldiers who had just come off patrol were standing in, everyone waiting their turn to receive food from the same kettles. There were no guards with drawn weapons standing over them, no separation between captors and captives except for the obvious difference in their uniforms. A cook, a young American who looked barely old enough to be in the army, gestured at one of the German prisoners and held up a ladle of what appeared to be beef stew, thick and dark, with visible chunks of meat and vegetables. The prisoner hesitated, glancing at the American guards nearby, trying to understand if this was some kind of test or trick. Was he really being offered food? Was he supposed to refuse? Was this some elaborate setup designed to humiliate him? The cook seemed to interpret his hesitation as uncertainty about the process, and simply went ahead and ladled a generous portion into a metal tray that he then held out to the German with an expression that suggested he did this 100 times a day and saw nothing unusual about it. The tray was heavy, and the prisoner's hands shook slightly as he took it. Whether from exhaustion or emotion or simple disbelief, it would have been impossible to say. He looked down at the food, and what he saw there seemed almost unreal. The stew was thick and substantial, not the watery gruel he might have expected, with pieces of actual beef visible among the potatoes and carrots, the whole thing covered in a rich brown gravy that steamed in the cold air. The prisoner hadn't eaten anything but cold bread and tinned meat, and not much of either for several days, and his body's reaction to the smell and sight of real food was immediate and overwhelming. His mouth flooded with saliva, his stomach cramped with sudden desperate hunger, and his hands trembled harder as he found a place to sit and raised the first spoonful to his mouth. The taste, when it hit his tongue, was almost shocking in its richness and complexity, salt and fat and the deep savoury flavour of meat that had been cooked properly, the vegetables still firm enough to have texture but soft enough to be easily eaten. The warmth of the food spread through his body like something physical, like a drug, and he found himself eating faster than he should, shoveling spoonfuls into his mouth with an urgency that embarrassed him even as he couldn't stop himself. Around him, the other prisoners were having similar reactions, staring into their trays as if they contained treasure, some of them eating in stunned silence, while others muttered expressions of disbelief in German that the American guards couldn't understand but whose tone was clear enough. One of the Americans set down a large metal jug of coffee, real coffee, and indicated that the prisoners should help themselves. One of the Germans approached it cautiously, poured a cup, and sniffed it suspiciously before taking a tentative sip. The bitterness surprised him, American coffee being stronger than what he was used to, but the warmth that spread through his chest and stomach was incredible, almost bringing tears to his eyes. He took another sip and another, feeling the heat of it chase away some of the cold that had settled into his core over the past weeks of inadequate food and constant exposure to the elements. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in the worldview of these captured German soldiers. All the propaganda they had been fed, all the stories about American softness and lack of military discipline, all the mockery of the field kitchens as symbols of an army that couldn't handle real hardship, all of it collapsed in the face of this simple reality. The Americans were providing hot meals under fire, not just to their own troops, but even to their prisoners, and they were doing it with a level of organization and efficiency that spoke of a system that had been carefully thought through and refined. This wasn't the behavior of a soft army or a disorganized one. This was the behavior of an army that had the resources and the will to take care of its people even in the most difficult circumstances, that treated proper nutrition not as a luxury but as an essential component of military effectiveness. The prisoners were beginning to understand that the field kitchens they had ridiculed were not a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that was backed by industrial and organizational capacity that Germany simply could not match. For men who had been raised on stories of German military superiority, who had been taught that hardship and austerity were virtues that made soldiers stronger, this realization was profoundly disorienting. Everything they thought they knew about warfare, about soldiering, about what made an army effective, was being called into question by this single meal in a field kitchen set up within earshot of active combat. The first meal was just the beginning of an education that would continue throughout their captivity. Over the following days and weeks, the German prisoners would come to understand just how thoroughly the American approach to military operations differed from what they had been taught. That initial shock of receiving hot food as prisoners began to give way to a more systematic observation and understanding of the entire logistical system that made such things possible. By the time a week had passed since their capture, the German soldiers no longer stared at the field kitchens with the wide-eyed disbelief of men witnessing something impossible. Instead, they lined up for meals with the same routine acceptance as everyone else, their metal trays ready, moving through the line with practiced efficiency. Morning coffee, in particular, became something they looked forward to, that first cup of hot liquid that helped chase away the chill of the night and prepare them for whatever the day might bring. For men who had spent years drinking ersatz coffee made from roasted grains and other substitutes, the real thing remained something special even after it became routine, each cup a small luxury that reminded them of better times. The Americans maintained a strict schedule for meals, breakfast at a set time in the morning, lunch in the middle of the day, dinner in the evening, all of it as regular as clockwork, regardless of what else might be happening. This adherence to routine felt strange to soldiers who had been trained to eat whenever and whatever was available, to take food when you could get it because you never knew when the next opportunity might come. The regularity of American mealtimes spoke to a confidence in their supply system that the Germans had never experienced in their own military, a certainty that the food would keep coming no matter what. The prisoners were assigned work details that included duties in the field kitchens themselves, simple tasks like peeling potatoes, stacking trays, cleaning the large kettles after meals, the kind of basic labour that any kitchen operation required. At first, some of the Germans balked at this, viewing kitchen work as beneath the dignity of combat soldiers, something that should be done by rear echelon troops or support personnel rather than by men who had fought on the front lines. But they quickly learned that in the American system, everyone took turns with this kind of work, that there was no stigma attached to it, and more importantly, that the men working in the kitchens often received extra portions of food or an additional slice of bread, small benefits that made the work worthwhile, despite any concerns about dignity. Through this hands-on experience, the prisoners gained an intimate understanding of how the American field kitchen system actually functioned at the most basic level. They saw how everything was labelled and organised, how ingredients were stored and tracked, how fuel consumption was measured and monitored to ensure efficiency. The recipes were standardised and designed to be scalable, capable of feeding anywhere from 50 to several hundred men without requiring significant changes to the basic process. Every aspect of the operation had been thought through and refined, from the design of the kettles that could keep food hot for extended periods to the way the serving line was organised to move large numbers of men through quickly. One of the German corporals, a man who had spent time before the war working in his family's restaurant and who had ridiculed the American field kitchens as recently as a few weeks ago, found himself genuinely impressed by the level of organisation and efficiency he was witnessing. He whispered to another prisoner, using a comparison that would have seemed like high praise if it hadn't been delivered in such a tone of reluctant admiration, that the Americans treated food the same way they treated ammunition, as a critical resource that needed to be managed carefully and delivered where it was needed most. It was, he realized, a fundamentally different philosophy of warfare than what he had been taught, one that recognized that soldiers who were well fed were more effective soldiers, and that the logistical challenges of keeping them fed were simply problems to be solved rather than insurmountable obstacles. The transformation in the physical condition of the prisoners was remarkable and rapid. Many of them had been operating on inadequate rations for months before their capture, their bodies slowly consuming their own reserves of fat and muscle as they struggled to maintain function on too few calories. Within a few weeks of receiving regular hot meals, their faces began to fill out, the gaunt hollows under their cheekbones disappearing as their bodies began to rebuild the tissues that had been lost. Their hands stopped trembling with the constant hunger that had become so familiar they had almost stopped noticing it. They felt their strength returning, found themselves able to work without the constant fatigue that had dragged at them before. The change was not just physical, but psychological as well. The regular meals created a sense of stability and predictability that had been absent from their lives for a long time, a routine that helped organize their days and gave them something to look forward to. The field kitchen became more than just a place to receive food. It became a social center where prisoners could gather and talk, where they could ask questions about the equipment and the processes they were witnessing, where they could begin to think about things beyond mere survival. Some of them found themselves asking the American cooks about recipes and cooking techniques, curious about how to prepare food for large numbers of people, how to maintain flavor while working at such scale, how to brew coffee properly so that it didn't turn bitter. The American cooks, many of whom were young men, not much different from the prisoners themselves, seemed amused by these questions, but answered them willingly, sometimes in broken German, other times through pantomime and demonstration when language failed. There was something almost surreal about these interactions, enemy soldiers discussing the finer points of stew preparation while artillery rumbled in the distance. But it created a strange kind of neutral ground where people could interact as human beings rather than as representatives of opposing armies. This humanizing effect of shared meals should not be underestimated. In the early days of their captivity, the relationship between the German prisoners and their American guards had been tense and wary, each side viewing the other through the lens of wartime propaganda and the suspicion that comes naturally in such situations. The Germans expected harsh treatment based on stories they had heard, while the Americans remained vigilant for any sign of trouble or escape attempts. But the daily ritual of gathering for meals, of standing in the same lines and eating the same food, began to soften those edges. Guards who had initially maintained strict professional distance began to greet familiar prisoners with nods or brief exchanges, sometimes attempting jokes in broken German that produced more confusion than laughter, but that nonetheless signaled a recognition of shared humanity. One young German prisoner, barely old enough to shave, worked up the courage to thank one of the cooks in halting English, and the cook responded with a smile and an extra ladle of stew. These small interactions, repeated countless times across the camp, began to create a different atmosphere, one where the war felt more distant, even though it continued all around them. This did not mean that the prisoners forgot they were prisoners, or that the Americans forgot their duty as guards, but it created what might be called a pocket of normalcy within the broader insanity of the conflict, a space where hot food and basic courtesy could blunt the edges of hostility and remind everyone involved that they were all just trying to survive circumstances that none of them had chosen. The letters that prisoners were allowed to write home reflected this fundamental shift in their understanding. While the censors would not permit them to include specific information about locations or military operations, they could write about their conditions and treatment, and many of them found themselves writing at length about the field kitchens. They described the mobile cooking equipment in detail, explained the system of regular hot meals, marveled at the organization and efficiency they had witnessed. One prisoner wrote to his family that he was eating hot stew twice a day, more and better food than his own army had ever provided, even during the best times before the war had started to go badly. Another described the American field kitchens with an almost technical fascination, detailing the design of the trailers and kettles, as if he were planning to build something similar himself once he got home. These letters, when they eventually reached their destinations, would carry with them a message that was potentially more damaging to German morale than any propaganda could have been. The simple truth that German soldiers were often better fed as prisoners of the Americans than they had been as fighting members of their own army. For the families receiving these letters, trying to survive in cities that were being bombed regularly while dealing with their own ration shortages, the descriptions of abundant food must have seemed to come from some alternate reality, a world where there was enough of everything and where even prisoners were treated with a level of care that civilians back home could only dream about. For the German officers among the prisoners, men who had been trained in military strategy and operations, the revelation went beyond the simple appreciation of hot food. They began to understand that what they were witnessing was not just a logistical curiosity, but a fundamental difference in how the Americans approached warfare itself. German military doctrine had been built around the concept of the lightning war, the Blitzkrieg, which emphasized rapid movement, concentration of force at decisive points, and the acceptance of logistical difficulties as a price worth paying for speed and surprise. The system worked brilliantly when it worked, but it had always carried within it the seeds of its own limitations. The supply lines that couldn't keep up with the advancing forces, the troops that fought on empty stomachs because the supply trucks couldn't reach them, the gradual degradation of combat effectiveness as exhaustion and hunger took their toll. The Americans, these officers were beginning to realize, had approached the problem from a completely different angle. Rather than accepting logistical limitations as inevitable, they had invested enormous resources in solving those problems, creating systems that could keep troops fed and supplied even during rapid advances or difficult conditions. The field kitchens were just one visible manifestation of this approach, but they represented something much larger, a military culture that valued proper support for its troops as much as it valued weapons and tactics. Some of the German officers began to whisper among themselves that this might be the real secret of Allied success, not just the material advantages everyone could see in terms of tanks and planes and artillery, but the invisible advantages of logistics and supply that allowed American troops to maintain their effectiveness over extended periods. "You could have all the tanks in the world," one officer observed quietly. "But if your crews were exhausted and hungry because your supply system couldn't keep up with them, you would still lose to an enemy whose troops were rested and well fed." It was a bitter lesson to learn, and it raised uncomfortable questions about decisions that had been made by the German High Command, about priorities and resource allocation, about the cost of pursuing certain types of military operations without adequate attention to the unglamorous but essential work of keeping armies supplied and functional. The camp itself began to feel less like a prison and more like an unintentional school, a place where German soldiers were receiving an education in American methods, whether anyone had planned for that to happen or not. Every meal served from the field kitchens was a practical demonstration of logistical capability. Every convoy of supply trucks that arrived on schedule was evidence of organizational skill. Every interaction with American personnel provided insight into a military culture that was in many ways the opposite of what they had been taught to value. The lessons were not always comfortable. It forced the prisoners to confront the possibility that much of what they had been told about their enemies, and by extension much of what they had been told about themselves, might have been wrong. The caricature of the soft American soldier lounging beside his field kitchen while real warriors went hungry was revealed as propaganda that served to make Germans feel better about their situation rather than as any kind of accurate assessment of military reality. The truth, which was becoming harder to deny with each passing day, was that comfort and effectiveness were not opposites, but rather could work together, that taking care of soldiers' basic needs was not a sign of weakness, but of strength, that an army capable of feeding its troops hot meals under fire was an army that had solved problems the German military was still struggling with. This realization bred a complex mixture of emotions among the prisoners. There was resentment at having been deceived by their own propaganda, anger at the leaders who had led them into an unwinnable conflict, a strange kind of respect for an enemy who had proven more capable than advertised, and perhaps most surprisingly, a growing sense of hope. If the Americans could build systems this effective, if they could organize logistics at this level while fighting a war, then perhaps the post-war world would not be as bleak as many had feared. Perhaps there were ideas and methods here that could be learned and adapted, ways of doing things that could be brought home once the war finally ended. As winter deepened around the prisoner of war camp, the contrast between conditions inside and outside the wire became more stark. Snow covered the ground and clung to the barbed wire fences. The sky stayed pale and seemed to promise nothing but more cold. Yet inside the camp, the field kitchens continued their relentless operation, producing meals that generated steam and heat that seemed to create small islands of warmth in the frozen landscape. The prisoners, who had once been gaunt and wary, now stood straighter during roll call, their bodies having recovered much of their strength thanks to 2 weeks of adequate nutrition. Their uniforms still bore the stains and tears of combat, visible reminders of where they had come from and what they had been through, but their faces no longer had that hollow, desperate look that comes from prolonged hunger and exhaustion. The relationship between the prisoners and their food had evolved through several stages, from that first shocking meal that seemed too good to be true, through the phase of grateful amazement, to a kind of routine acceptance that nonetheless retained an element of appreciation. They understood now that the regular hot meals were not some temporary aberration or special treatment, but rather reflected standard American military practice, the baseline expectation of how soldiers should be fed regardless of circumstances. This understanding carried with it an implicit comparison to their own military, a comparison that was not favourable to the Wehrmacht, and that raised questions about priorities and leadership that were dangerous to voice aloud, but that occupied many private thoughts. The process of serving food became a strange kind of bridge between two groups of men who were supposed to be enemies, but who were discovering, meal by meal, that they had more in common than they had differences. American cooks who had initially viewed the prisoners with wariness or hostility, seeing them as representatives of an enemy that had caused so much death and destruction, gradually came to see them as individuals, young men not so different from themselves, who had been caught up in events beyond their control. German prisoners who had been taught to view Americans as racially and culturally inferior, as soft and undisciplined and lacking the warrior spirit that made the German military supposedly superior, found those beliefs impossible to maintain in the face of daily evidence to the contrary. The guards, who once maintained rigid professional distance and watched the prisoners with suspicion for any sign of trouble, began to relax somewhat, engaging in brief conversations when the opportunity arose, sometimes attempting to communicate across language barriers through gestures and the few words of each other's languages they had picked up. None of this erased the war or changed the fundamental fact that these men were on opposite sides of a deadly conflict, but it created what might be called a humanitarian space within that conflict, a place where basic decency and recognition of shared humanity could exist despite everything. The field kitchen, with its regular meals and its role as a gathering place, had become the physical centre of that space, the location where captors and captives came together multiple times each day in a ritual that emphasised their similarities rather than their differences. The German soldiers found themselves discussing and analysing what they were witnessing with the intensity of students trying to understand a complex subject. During their work details and in the evenings after the day's activities were finished, they would gather in small groups and talk through what they had seen, trying to understand the principles behind the American system and how those principles might be applied in different contexts. Some of them, particularly those who had backgrounds in business or engineering before the war, approached the subject with an analytical mindset, breaking down the field kitchen operation into its component parts and examining how each piece contributed to the overall effectiveness of the system. They noted things like the standardization of equipment that made maintenance and training easier, the careful attention to fuel efficiency that allowed the kitchens to operate even when supply lines were stretched thin, the flexibility of the design that permitted the same basic equipment to be used in many different situations, from field conditions to more permanent installations. Others focused on the human elements, the training of the cooks who could produce good-tasting food in large quantities under difficult conditions, the discipline required to maintain cleanliness and food safety standards even when operating in muddy fields, the leadership that ensured the whole system functioned smoothly even when facing challenges. A few of the prisoners began to speak, quietly and carefully, because these were still dangerous thoughts in some ways, about what might be possible if similar systems were implemented in Germany after the war ended. They dreamed aloud about better logistics, more respect for the basic needs of working people, organizational methods that valued efficiency and taking care of people, rather than just demanding endurance and sacrifice. These conversations represented a fundamental shift in thinking for men who had been raised in a culture that glorified hardship and viewed comfort with suspicion, a shift toward recognizing that perhaps there were better ways to organize things, ways that produced better results without requiring people to suffer unnecessarily. The observations and insights gained during captivity were crystallizing into something that might be called a new worldview for many of these German soldiers. They were coming to understand that strength in warfare came not just from weapons and tactics and the willingness of soldiers to sacrifice themselves, but from the entire system that supported those soldiers, from the farms and factories that produced food and equipment to the transportation networks that moved supplies forward to the field kitchens that turned those supplies into hot meals that maintained combat effectiveness. The Americans had built an integrated system where every part supported every other part, where taking care of soldiers' basic needs was recognized as essential rather than as a luxury, where logistics was elevated to the same level of importance as combat operations. This was warfare as practiced by an industrial society that had the resources and the organizational capacity to do things properly, that didn't have to choose between feeding its troops and arming them because it could do both. The contrast with Germany's increasingly desperate situation was painful to contemplate. While these prisoners were eating hot stew and drinking real coffee multiple times per day, their families back home were surviving on rations that grew more meagre each week. Their former comrades still fighting were making do with whatever supplies could reach them through supply lines that were being systematically destroyed by Allied air power. The abundance they witnessed as prisoners highlighted the scarcity that was becoming the defining characteristic of life in Germany, made it impossible to ignore the reality that their nation was losing not just militarily, but in terms of its ability to sustain the basic functions of civilization. By the spring of 1945, the end of the war was approaching in ways that were obvious to everyone, even if the exact timing remained uncertain. The prisoners could see it in the streams of Allied convoys that rolled past their camp, in the constant thunder of aircraft overhead, in the news that filtered through even the most careful censorship. The German soldiers watched American supply columns with something approaching professional appreciation now, seeing in those long lines of trucks and trailers the physical manifestation of the logistical superiority that had been such a revelation to them. Many of those trucks were towing field kitchen trailers, the same equipment that had seemed so absurd when they first heard about it, now recognized as an essential tool of modern warfare. The prisoners could see that these kitchens were still feeding troops on the move, that the American ability to provide hot meals under fire had not been some temporary expedient or propaganda stunt, but represented standard operating procedure that would continue right up to the final victory. Inside the camp, the daily rhythm that had become so familiar continued without disruption. Hot food at dawn to start the day, warm stew at dusk to end it, the same reliable schedule that had governed their lives for months now. The prisoners had learned to measure their time in captivity not by punishments or hardships, but by mealtimes, by the regular provision of sustenance that marked the passage of days and weeks. What had begun as shocking and unbelievable had become simply normal, the smell of coffee in the morning no longer startling them, the clatter of trays no longer seeming alien or out of place. For many of the prisoners, this entire experience had planted seeds that would grow and shape their thinking long after the war ended. The realization that there were different ways to organize society, different approaches to taking care of people, different philosophies about the relationship between leaders and those they led. These ideas could not be unlearned, even if someone had wanted to forget them. The questions that had been raised by something as simple as a mobile field kitchen serving hot meals under fire would continue to resonate. If an army could treat even its prisoners with this level of care and systematic attention to their well-being, what did that say about the society that had created that army? What values must such a society hold? And conversely, what did it say about their own society that such care had not been provided to its own soldiers, that Germany's approach to warfare had been built around demanding sacrifice and endurance while providing as little support as possible? These were not comfortable questions to contemplate, but they were impossible to avoid for men who had seen the contrast so clearly. Some of the prisoners made quiet resolutions about what they would do when they returned home, assuming they survived to return home at all. They spoke of copying these ideas, of advocating for better systems, for more attention to logistics and support, for a recognition that taking care of people properly was not weakness but wisdom. They talked about building better field kitchens for the German army if there would be a German army in the future, about improving supply systems, about treating soldiers with more respect and attention to their basic needs. These conversations were tentative and careful, because it was still dangerous to criticize too openly even among prisoners, but they represented a genuine shift in thinking brought about by the education they had received through observation and participation. American guards who had been watching over these prisoners for months noticed the changes that had occurred. The hard stares of defiance that had characterized the early days of captivity had softened into something more complex, a mixture of resignation and reflection and perhaps even grudging respect. The questions from the prisoners had evolved from defensive challenges to genuine curiosity, from "Why would you do this?" asked with scorn to "How do you do this?" asked with interest. In the evenings, after the work details were finished, prisoners could be seen gathering near the fence line to watch the convoys that passed by on the nearby road, studying the equipment and organization with the intensity of students examining a particularly interesting problem. They pointed out details to each other, discussed what they were seeing, made comparisons to German methods and supplies. The American guards sometimes wondered what the prisoners were thinking during these observations, what conclusions they were drawing from the endless stream of trucks and supplies that represented a level of military logistics that Germany had never been able to match even at the height of its power. The reality was that the prisoners were thinking about many things, about the war and its outcome, about their own futures and the future of their country, about the lessons they had learned from something as unlikely as a field kitchen, about how their entire understanding of military power and effectiveness had been transformed by the simple act of being fed properly. The letters that prisoners wrote home during this period, when they were still allowed to write and when the postal system still functioned enough to carry mail, reflected the profound nature of this transformation. They wrote about the field kitchens with an almost wistful tone, describing the equipment and the routine and the food itself in detail that suggested they were trying to preserve these memories, to create a record they could refer back to later. Some described the insulated kettles and the mobile stoves as if they were writing technical specifications, clearly thinking about how such things might be constructed and operated. Others focused on the experience of eating hot meals regularly, the way it made them feel physically and mentally, the difference it made in their to think clearly and maintain their strength. A few wrote about the broader implications of what they had witnessed, careful to phrase things in ways that might get past the censors, but nonetheless trying to convey to family members back home that the war had taught them things that went beyond simple military lessons, that they had seen different ways of doing things that suggested different ways of organizing society itself. For the families who received these letters, assuming they received them at all, given the chaos that was consuming Germany in the final months of the war, the descriptions must have seemed to come from another world, a world where there was enough food and where even prisoners were treated with systematic care, a stark contrast to the reality of German cities being bombed into rubble and civilians barely surviving on rations that provided fewer calories than a prisoner in an American camp received. Years after the war ended, when historians began interviewing former German soldiers about their experiences during the conflict, many would point to their time as American prisoners of war as one of the most significant periods of their military service, not because of any particular hardship or suffering they endured, but because of what they learned and how it changed their understanding of the world. When asked about specific memories that stood out, many mentioned the American field kitchens with surprising consistency and emotion. They remembered that first hot meal after capture with a clarity that suggested it had been a deeply meaningful moment, remembered the shock of receiving food when they expected cruelty, remembered the warmth and taste and how it made them feel. They described watching the Americans cook under fire as an experience that shattered their preconceptions and forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about military operations. Some spoke of the field kitchens as representing something larger than just food, as symbols of a different approach to warfare and to human relationships, as evidence that strength could take forms they had not been taught to recognize. The fact that these memories remained so vivid decades later spoke to their importance, to the way this experience had marked them and shaped their subsequent thinking. In the end, the mobile field kitchens that German propaganda had once mocked as proof of American softness had accomplished something that no amount of traditional propaganda could have achieved. They had changed minds through direct experience, had demonstrated through practical example that proper care of soldiers was not incompatible with military effectiveness, but was actually an essential component of it, had shown that logistics and organization could be as powerful as weapons in determining the outcome of conflicts. The German soldiers who witnessed this system in operation, who benefited from it as prisoners, carried those lessons with them for the rest of their lives. They understood in a way that people who had not experienced both systems could not fully grasp that the hot meals served under fire were not signs of weakness, but quiet demonstrations of unstoppable organizational power, evidence of a society that had the resources and the will to take care of its people even in the most difficult circumstances. When these men returned to Germany and began the long process of rebuilding their country and their lives, some of them brought with them ideas about better logistics, better organization, more attention to the basic needs of working people. Whether they explicitly remembered the field kitchens when advocating for these changes, or whether the influence was more subtle and indirect, the lessons learned during captivity contributed to shaping the post-war world. The field kitchen had proven to be more than just a piece of military equipment. It had been a teacher, showing through the simple act of providing hot meals under fire that there were different ways to do things, better ways that produced better results, ways that valued human beings rather than treating them as expendable resources. That lesson, learned in prisoner of war camps across Europe in 1944 and 1945, would echo through the decades that followed. A testament to the idea that sometimes the most powerful weapons in war are not the ones that destroy, but the ones that sustain and build and demonstrate what is possible when resources are used wisely and people are treated with respect.